Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the special meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee. My apologies that we're starting a little late. I'm joined by Vice Chair Mitchell Englander and the Honorable Paul Koretz as well. We have one item on the agenda today, and that is communication from the Mayor regarding the GRID office and reports back that were requested by this committee. And I just want to start by saying that, first of all, members, you should have received the written report already from the Mayor's office over the weekend. And I do want to say that we're hearing this report, we're having this special meeting specific to GRID that doesn't suggest anything in particular about GRID. I think it's going to be the practice, I know that it is going to be the practice of this committee over the coming year, that we are going to be looking in somewhat greater detail at some of the budget considerations about all of the departments of this city, as I've discussed many times over the course of our budget hearings. So this is an opportunity for us to really dig into some details, and I welcome having that opportunity, and I welcome staff here who's going to present the report. So why don't we go ahead and call this matter and bring it forward.
Sure. As you mentioned, this is a special meeting. We have one item on the agenda. This is a communication from the Mayor relative to information for the Gang Reduction and Youth Development Office, including actual revenue and expenditures over the last 4 years, negotiated contract savings and unexpended contract balances, and clarification regarding previously secured grants, pending grants, and future grants awards.
Good morning, Neil Guglielmo with the Mayor's Office.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for having us this morning, sir, and council members. What we provided is essentially responses to the questions as we understood them from both your committee and from the CAO's office. And there were 5 questions essentially that were responded to, 5 large questions. And there are several component parts to each. We have both a written narrative response as well as a number of attachments as well. We'd be happy I can walk you through the general overview of the response if you like, or we can entertain questions however you would prefer.
I've reviewed the report. I'm sure the members have reviewed the report. I'm not sure if an overview is necessary unless anybody would like them to do that. If not, we can, I think, go direct to member questions, if that's okay.
No, that'd certainly be fine.
And also...
Yes, my name is Guillermo Cespedes, and I will be addressing primarily programmatic concerns, policy issues that have to do with the programmatic structure of the office.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. Mr. Koretz, you have questions?
Yeah, a couple of questions. The Mayor's response isn't entirely clear on how much GRID saved, or if GRID saved money by negotiating down its contracts with contractors, as we asked all departments and agencies to do. So what effort was made, how much did we save in that regard, et cetera?
Certainly. If I can direct your attention to Attachment 3, the last 2 pages of Attachment 3 cover fiscal years 10-11 and fiscal years 11-12, the current fiscal year. And I believe in the narrative response we provided a couple of examples of the changes that were made, but the details in the Attachment 3 are actually by contract, prevention contracts versus intervention contracts in primary and secondary areas. And you can note from the 10-11 to the 11-12 that the contract amounts go down. An example would be the third item down, the Community Build Incorporated, which is contract 114706, Grid Zone Baldwin Village. The contract amount 10-11 was $1 million. And then if you were to turn to the next page, the contract amount for the same contract for the same area, Baldwin Village, is $900,000. So it goes down from $1 million to $900,000. You can also note this goes contract by contract. The subtotal down below, you'll see the change from 10-11 $11.8 million roughly to the $10.8 million. So you can see that reduction in the prevention grid zone contract amount. And you'll also note, just going further down on the attachments, the changes, the reductions also reflected for the intervention grid zones go from the $6.147 million in 10-11 to the $5.8 million in 11-12, and then so on and so forth. So there's a reduction. We provided that information kind of contract by contract. The contracts will have different funding sources as well. And I'll defer to GMO in terms of how the process went, if you'd like to have process questions on how those reductions were taken.
Just one other question. I know Grid wasn't asked to take the same 8% cut in salaries that some of the elected offices and other departments were asked to take. Why not?
Well, as we went through and essentially worked with the mayor to prepare the proposed budget, we looked at all the costs respective to the departments, and then looking at the priorities. One of the highest priorities the mayor had was the gang reduction program. So we did not, at the time of the proposed budget, identify a cut to be taken on the grid salaries. However, as part of the committee and budget development process, the changes made by committee, the mayor's office has agreed to take a reduction in both the appropriation side of the $1.5 million in change, which essentially is the HACLA loan repayment, which we had budgeted, and then $200,000 that would come from the salaries and office line expenses within the grid office. And so we'd agreed to make that reduction of over $1.5 million, and that's what we will stand by. We'll live within the reduced appropriation limit.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. We're joined by Mr. Rosendahl. Mr. Rosendahl, would you
Not at this
have any
point.
questions? All right. Mr. Englander.
None. No, I'm just kidding. Morning.
Morning.
I have a lot of programmatic questions, but and so I do appreciate that you came. First, I want to compliment you on, and you presented a lot of statistics and information on the program during the budget deliberations. I still welcome a one-on-one briefing and talk about some of those issues and
Of
concerns
course.
and ideas, and also and to learn more about
Of course.
some of the programs. And if this were an appropriate time to discuss some of those questions, then we could probably spend the next hour or so doing that and learning all about a lot of the wonderful achievements that I do want to hear about. And perhaps since the offer's on the table for the programmatic discussion and dialogue, which I would welcome one-on-one, but maybe the best place for that would be in committee, but Public Safety
Sure.
Committee, and we could certainly have that, and we could talk about that in the
We would welcome
near
that.
future as
I would
well. That'd be
welcome
great.
that.
Being that we're trying to close off the year-end budget, and this is the Budget Committee, and I know some of the discussions, this is strictly as it relates to the numbers, and I want to thank Neil and the folks that brought this information forward. I know it was a last-minute sort of scrounging of trying to go back and comb through numbers, and there was also because it was bridges and it changed and it went into a different program, and then it was added on to with different types of programs from different grants, and so there was a lot of different information, a lot of things to collate and bring together, and as if we weren't busy enough. I truly appreciate it, and that was on the eve of weeks of dealing with the budget and all the other departments, and so I appreciate that. And looking at a lot of this information, I know I have just a few questions. One, to start off, in going back just to some of the questions, the basic questions that we had asked in committee. First, what really brought this up was the fact, and I wanted to highlight what our budget chair, Mr. Corian, had shared as well, is that there was a lot of concern or questions from folks who, particularly the youth and the program administrators, who were concerned that this could potentially be a threat or a cut to GRID, just even having the dialogue and the questions. And it wasn't. In fact, we said in the budget committee that it was our objective, and I think this was unanimous, that we wanted to maintain, even during the tough budget times when we're cutting severely either other departments or programs, that public safety is first and foremost the most important function in the city of LA, and just the program highlights and what GRID has done to bring those numbers down. We've seen reductions categorically in all crime in the last several years, every single year, and that's attributed to many variables, GRID certainly being at the top of that list without a doubt. And but it was this committee that said that we want to maintain it. We don't, unfortunately, right now, probably have the money to grow almost anything when we're looking at other cuts in other departments. And so maintaining current levels were critically important. I believe it was the chair that pointed out, as I started to say, that in fact we were stepping up even further to say that we acknowledge and realize that the federal grant programs, as well as private foundations and the state reimbursements, are depleting, and they're bleak. And because of that, we're stepping up even further to say, let's take money out of the general fund to cover some of those shortages. And we all agreed that we need to do that because we have to protect the most vulnerable areas of the city of Los Angeles. And so the questions that come into play were not and continue to be only budget related as it pertains to maintaining current levels and trying to figure out what the true levels are. And so with that, and I thought it was important to sort of set that tone since I started the dialogue, and I've gotten a lot of calls and letters from our providers and young folks who have done well because of the program, so I appreciate their outreach efforts. And some of the questions that I did have relate to, first of all, one of the questions on it was stated that we have outside matching funds from outside foundations for Summer Night Lights programs, and we were asking for some detail into what we have proposed coming in this year. It was stated on the record during committee that we expect around, with the asks that are out there right now, about $3 million, so that's about what we have in pledges. And then if we turn to the attachment, and this is attachment 2, where it has the SNL year, private funding, foundations, individual donors, and corporate donors. First, let me applaud whoever's doing the ask, because every single year this has gone up substantially. And this has gone up in a time when the economy has gone down. Mm-hmm. And so I want to acknowledge your efforts, and
Thank you,
that's tremendous. And in fact, we had one year where it appears here in 2009, we had about 1.2 million in donations from 38 foundation and individuals and 20 corporate. But the following year, and this is fascinating, the following year in 2010, that jumped up to $2 million, yet the foundation individual donors dropped nearly in half, and the corporate donors dropped over 50%. And yet you were able to maximize those contributions and get even more. That's incredible. I've got some other nonprofits that we can use some help with. I'll have you serve on those boards as well. That's an art. And then we get into the following year, the same thing, and it went up again this last year to 2.8 million. We're expecting roughly 3 million. What I didn't see is where the 3 million comes into play in the overall budget, and this year, and with some detail on where that's plugged into the projected expenditures or appropriations, and so if that does come in and it's not in fact included, would we just add more programs at that point when the dollars come in?
No. From the fundraising point of view, what we do is that we have a core of foundations that we've been working with since 2008, as the program has evolved and there's been outcome data to prove the effectiveness of the program, some of the foundations have pledged multi-year pledges. Our fundraising efforts actually go throughout the summer. So that's why it's listed as pending.
I see. Okay, so as it's pending, if we turn to attachment 1, and where we have our proposed 1213 and adjusted budget and finance adjusted 1213, where is that $3 million plugged into?
Okay. So, Councilmember, the $3 million that comes in from the private donations, the corporate sponsorships and such, go into a private nonprofit, which holds and trusts those funds and then makes payments for the expenditures. It's not
Correct.
reflected here because we as a city don't have direct control over those funds once they come in.
Great, okay. And so if that's the case, and that's sort of an offset to cover, and that's to cover the Summer Night Lights
Correct.
programs, correct?
Correct.
It would appear that there's an off-budget spreadsheet, and for good reason, we don't control it, that does cover, though, expenditures, and if those come in, then it helps offset costs that we would have been paying out. And so we'll revisit that in a
Right.
second. And I've got some suggested budget language on how we can deal with any offsets that are over and above
Certainly.
our.
If I could just, though, in terms of the
Budget.
Summer Night Lights program, the appropriations that were requested as part of the proposed budget essentially would cover the city half of the portion of the SNL program. The other portion of the SNL program was intended to be covered by the private donations and the corporate sponsorships. And so the cost of the full program isn't reflected here either.
So let me ask you that question. If it didn't come in, or if there's a shortfall, would we be then coming back to this committee or to the city to ask for additional funds? Because those aren't guaranteed, are they, right now? I mean, do we have it in hand?
We have a committee, it's not in hand yet. We meet with our foundation-funded funders, and last summer we decided the number of parks, what budget was needed, and what commitments were on the table. So we fully expect that we're going to get it. It's not in the...
So my question is, if it didn't come in, then would we be cutting the programs, or would we be coming back to ask for more funds, or would we be looking to create just efficiencies within the programs themselves
Well,
to continue what we've got going on?
we haven't had that issue come up before, and this is the 5th year that we're going into the program. We haven't come up with an issue of our funders not living up to their financial commitment.
Well, I understand that, but in this economy, in this day and age, and I sit on a dozen right now nonprofit boards, as well as being the vice chair of this committee, and we have folks that unfortunately don't have the ability to live up to their means every day or fulfill their promises or obligations. It just happens. Or they come back and say, we pledged $1 million, but we can't do it this year, although we're still good for it. We're going to stretch it out over the next 10. Or whatever that case that may be. I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios that come up, particularly in this economy. And typically, without drilling down into that too much, it sounds like we just haven't explored
Right.
that as a scenario, is what I'm hearing.
I think were that to come up where there's a gap in the private funding side of the equation for the program, then we'd be looking to find efficiencies within the program to the greatest extent possible to cover that gap that remains. Obviously, we're very aware of the situation of the general fund and the continuing deficits we face ahead. So we'd be trying to find those efficiencies and live within available funds that are provided by the corporate sector. But
Do we have contracts already with the vendors in place, or we're negotiating those now to lock in the programs for Summer Night Lights?
I think it's important just to look at it from the point of view for a minute of the Summer Night Lights program is one of 2 components that is directly run by our staff.
Oh, no, I get that. So my question, though, is we have a proposed budget, and we have contracts to carry forth all of these obligations throughout the year of what the budget, that's how we got to the budget.
Correct.
Those are going to be for staff as well as programs. And so we lock those in now. And in fact, what I'm being told is we're putting this through the committee and council, and there's a holding place now in council because you want to secure those contracts.
Correct.
So the question is, if we have, the contracts are 100% with the city of LA,
The contracts, including the SNL contracts.
is that correct?
The SNL contracts, some are with nonprofits, some are part of our annual job responsibilities in that we run that program. That program is staffed by my staff during the summer. The youth that we hire, we're interviewing now. We have it all in place. We haven't signed a contract with them. The gang intervention component, a component of that will be covered by their yearly contract. So a component of Summer Night Lights is run by our staff and the staff that CBOs
So
that we contract
I
throughout
got
the
it.
year.
Okay, and I know we got to wrap up pretty quick because we've got council and I still have a few more questions that I really wanted to get through, if that's okay with the chair. So I think it's something we've got to look at, that we've got obligations that we're negotiating yet, and so I don't know the total cost of those programs. They're not disclosed here, or how much money we have anticipated coming in on pledges, because that just says pending categorically. It's been stated of $3 million, but it's not on any of the spreadsheets or who they might be. And I understand the reason for non-disclosure, but there could be a confidential disclosure or something to indicate how strong they may or may not be, because we are liable as a city for those contracts. So, got to figure out if we are fully funding those in the budgets, and then those come in afterwards or during the year. Is that in fact increasing the overall budget of the programs? Those are the questions I think we're going to have to look at in considering this. The other part was looking at the attachment 1. We've got actuals for 08-09, actuals for 9-10, actuals for 10-11. Then we have an adopted 11-12 and a projected 11-12, but we have no actuals for 11-12. And we're proposing our 12-13 fiscal year on the actuals from 11-12, but there are no actuals for 11-12 provided, and maybe they're not readily available. But are there, Neil, maybe I can ask you, are there regular monthly or quarterly financial status reports from GRID to the CAO's office?
Yes, the GRID office does provide regular financial status reports to the CAO's office. I believe Cami Fawn is the analyst in the CAO's office that the GRID office works with on those financial status reports.
Okay. And then we're at year end now, and I would assume then the year end would be closer to the actuals for the 11-12 if the year end has been supplied as all the other departments have. I would assume GRID has supplied the CAO with the year end?
Correct. So the GRID office has provided information to the CAO for the year end. I think it was based on actuals through perhaps April. So it won't be reflective of any actuals that have occurred since then. It will be based on information, I think, through the end of April.
Can we get a copy of that document prior to council today?
We can give a copy of the FSR. I believe we can provide a copy of the FSR submittal to the CAO for your office.
Does that all have closer to the actuals than adopted or projected?
Well, the projected column on the spreadsheet here includes both actuals and projections, and it's based on reports that we've run through the city's PACER system and FMS. So we do have a great deal of backup documents for the actuals, and the projected just reflects the additional expenditures and encumbrances we expect for the end of the fiscal year, given that we have a closeout process that really will take from, say, September through December on many of these contracts. So, we do have probably more recent actual data partway through May that's reflected in the 11-12 projected column, sir.
Okay. Well, I think that's what we got to look at, because if we looked at adopted 11-12 versus projected 11-12, adopted was 16 million, projected is 26 million. I don't know how we got from 16 to 26. I'm assuming that some of that detail will be then in the financial status report.
Correct. I mean, if I can call your attention to attachment 1, under the interim appropriations section within the revenues, the largest portion of that really is the grants, which are reflected on attachment 2. And a lot of these are multi-year grants, but the grants are really off budget in terms of how they are put through in the proposed budget, the adopted budget by the Mayor and Council. So they weren't reflected in terms of the adopted, but they are reflected in terms of the interim appropriation actions for 11-12. And the balance would be the carryover reappropriations and transfers from
Right.
prior savings.
And so, and you brought the grants up, and so where we started off in 08-09 at 19 million, and we go up to projected budget currently at about 26 million.
Correct.
28 million was originally proposed for 12-13, so from 19 to 28 million. As we stated in the beginning of this, is that we want to try to maintain where things are at. It appears that from the grant attachments, there have been a lot of new grants applied for every year. Some of these grants, and they're variable, many of which are funded for either 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, but not every year. And it was stated that some of these grants are fixed on programmatic description, so they're restricted for very specific types of programs. And if we go back and look at, we've started some of the grant programs from the beginning of time. They were only granted the first year and or the second year, and they run throughout that in the last several years, where we've started grant programs, and then the grant ends, and we go after a different type of grant, and that's a fixed program as well. But every year, our budget's gone up to reflect the grant income, and we've maintained it, and now we're offsetting the overall budget in GRID to capture what we're losing in grants. But many of those grant programs have been very specific on what they do. In other words, this year right now, I think there's 2 grants that were being proposed. It was stated in committee. One is for international gang something, right?
Technical assistance.
Technical assistance. And there's another one that's very specific as well. So we add additional staff, we bring those programs in, but if it's one-time grant funding, that's very specific, but yet we're maintaining those same programs every year, and now we're paying for it out of the general fund. I get into the programmatic questions of how are we measuring whether those programs should be or could be or sustained. What should we be doing in terms of making it a budget priority to continue those ongoing programs that were one-time grant funded? Because we haven't lost any of those programs. And so those get more into...
Let me speak programmatically first about the issue you just brought up. Those are grants that are for a specific period of time to carry out a specific time frame of technical assistance or gang-specific services in a particular area.
Right, but we've grown GRID every single year as it's detailed in the reports. Yet those grants, when they run out, we continue to fund them, those programs every year, then out of the general fund, which is what we're doing this year. And so I think at some other opportunity, we've got to look at those and figure out if that is in fact those particular programs should continue or not, because we've grown GRID roughly 10 million over the last few years to keep up with those, to make up for the grants that we've lost.
Yes, sir. Essentially, you're correct in that what has happened is we have seen a dropping off of some of the federal and state grant support that we've received for the GRID program that we had realized and been able to count on in prior years. And then in order to keep GRID at the same level of programmatic delivery of services, we were looking to add the general fund money in the budget for the 12-13 to keep the program at the same level in light of the fact that we weren't having the same levels of carryover savings from contracts as well as the grants weren't there. I think as we come forward with additional grants, and those go to the council obviously for consideration as well. It's in light of, are those grants, whether it be maintenance of service efforts that are required as part of a grant, what's the time frame for a grant, what are the implications down the road for the general fund if we're going to accept a grant? Is this really for a prescribed period of time that will then end and that'll be it, or will it be a continuing obligation on the part of the city? And those are the issues that obviously do come up, and I believe the CAO looked at those too when they make recommendations to the council on whether or not we should receive or accept a grant award, for example.
And I'll just close it with a couple recommendations real quick on that. One is that under the ad code, and we're doing this in my committee in public safety now, we've mandated that all grants don't come in after they've been applied for acceptance. They come in prior to applying, which is what the code says, which is what we don't do in the city of LA. But the code's very specific that when we're applying for a grant, that's what we're asking for in public safety now. That's up to the chair if that's what we're going to end up doing in this committee at some point in time.
I'm sorry, restate that, please.
That when the city is applying for a grant, they come to committee and ask that they apply for the grant. They don't come after the fact and say, we've applied, we're asking for acceptance. And so that way we get our arms around. They don't come in 3 months after the fact and say, we started a program, we need the money.
Mildred Lopez with the Grid Office. I think the issue in the past has been that normally the grants that we apply for, there's a 30-day turnaround period to once the grant opportunity is released, we have 30 days to put together a 30-page, 50-page proposal, get letters of support, MOUs, and so forth. There's not enough time for us to submit a request for authority to members of committee in time to be able to put that package together and submit it in a timely manner. I think that's been the issue in the past, and that's why there's a special code to allow us to apply for grants and then come back and report to council once we apply and we receive those grant funds.
Yeah, I was simply suggesting, that's the exception, not the rule, but we've overall, and not just GRID, every department citywide, that's why we've talked about a grants office for years. We've talked about doing things trying to differently to manage our grant systems, but it's a whole nother discussion. But yeah, it's become more the regular standard operating procedure than the exception to the rule. And there's exceptions, but that's what we've been doing in every department.
Right.
And so we're looking at that. But with that, I would ask that then we adopt the report with certain recommendations, and that the all incoming grants not received and accounted for in the adopted budget be accepted, with the caveat that the grant acceptance amount thereby reduce the general fund contribution by the like amount, and so that money be returned either to the reserve fund or the general fund. So we keep it whole as we've always stated. The other recommendation is that any fundraising amount received in excess of what is being suggested for SNL program be used to pay down that part of the $3 million general fund contribution for the program in that amount, and then also be returned to either the reserve or the general fund. And that the mayor's office report back to this committee no later than September 2012 with any unspent contractual grant or other funds for fiscal year 11-12, and the money be swept and into either the general fund or reserve up to that amount. And again, what that would do is maintain our consistency of saying we're going to keep it exactly where we're at. And then lastly, the last suggestion, or actually I think it's not even part of the recommendations, but it's just ensuring we'll have the financial status report that was submitted to the CAO's office prior to council this morning, or or prior to when this comes. We hear it at council in a few minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question about that recommendation.
Before we do, because I know it's not part of the dialogue, we don't even have a second on the recommendations yet, and so if I could just follow some procedures from the chair, I'd respect.
Well, I'd like to hear what Mr. Cespedes has to say.
Well, my question has to do with, we have 2 grants listed here specifically that have already been applied for that will require a specific scope of work. Those will require some new staffing to carry out those projects for the period of time for the grant. So if those get swept, we can't use those grants to provide the same services we're providing now that were applied to specifically for because there is an unmet need.
But okay, and part of what's in the proposed budget includes those already. So what we're talking about is anything over and above that. And what we're really talking about is
I understand.
the supplemental to what's
I
coming out of the
understand.
general fund.
I understand.
So I think that has absolutely been acknowledged.
I understand.
So the essence of the proposal is that if there are revenues that come in that aren't currently anticipated in the budget, that revenue would be used as an offset for the excess general fund contribution above what was provided last year.
Correct.
Is that in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, without the technicalities, correct.
Thoughts, Mr. Guglielmo?
So, Mr. Chair, I think my thoughts would be that we want to ensure that the GRID program, that we go as aggressive as we can to leverage outside funds. And to the greatest extent possible, when we leverage those outside funds, if they can be used to help offset general fund costs, I think we'd be very open to that. But in some cases, when it comes to the grants, as we know, it really relies upon other work or additions or enhancements that wouldn't allow for us to essentially then give up general fund money, wouldn't supplant general fund. It would be, money for a new effort, a new program, a new initiative. And we would just like your consideration for that in light of the importance of the work, because not every grant will be allowed to be used to help offset our general fund. As much as we believe our general fund is critical for us, when we talk to the grantor agencies, I don't know that that's going to resonate as well with them, given they're all, the state and federal government have their own financial challenges as well.
Right.
Mr. Chairman?
Well, yeah, Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you. I move that we request that the mayor's office / grid office report to this committee upon acknowledgement of any grants that they are granted or that the city will receive, and then that this committee deliberate over whether or not it's supplantable. In other words, the money can be returned to the general fund, and or that this committee make the decision as to what would be the disposition of those funds and or an offset of funds already budgeted for grid.
I'll second that.
So if I understand that motion, the point is that if the eventuality that Mr. Englander has described should come about, if there is excess revenues that aren't currently anticipated in the budget, that GRID would be reporting back to this committee, and then we would evaluate.
That happens automatically anyway by policy and by process. What I would suggest is that I go back to my original motion because it was just stated that most grants can't even come to this until after the fact. And we can't make that determination, and then the program's already been dialed in because we've applied for the grant. And so it's at that point. We've got to do so as a policy statement that we're going to maintain, as we've said in the budget process.
Sure.
GRID at its current proposed status.
But Mr. Chairman, there are two issues. I think you just described something completely different than what my motion was, Councilmember Englander, and that is that one is the notification to the council when there's an intent to apply for a grant. That's one issue. But there's another issue when a grant is, when the city or / mayor's office is being notified that they're getting a grant, that they're being awarded a grant, that they immediately notify the council, that this committee take that up. Those are two different issues. Obviously, they're grant source issues, but one is the application of, and the other one is receiving of. And I think that it's wholly appropriate that that the council be notified whenever a grant is being applied for. That's issue number one. I think that the city council is, in fact, always the authority that determines how monies will be spent by the city, whether it be general fund or a grant. So to me, my motion speaks to the latter. If you want to make a motion speaking specifically to the procedures that, for example, GRID shall follow or the mayor's office shall follow should they anticipate or attempt to apply for a grant, then I'll be for that too. But I think that you're covering two issues.
Well, I have three motions on the table, so you're right.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Three
Mr. Cardenas, if I may then, if I'm understanding you correctly, the point is that through that reporting process, because the council would always have the option of making a mid-year adjustment, dealing with it in the FSR, making a mid-year reduction, even if we chose to. That would be something that could be done upon receiving the report back about excess revenues. Is that the import of it?
Correct.
But you would
But
have
also,
the full
my
scope
motion
of
has to do with
information.
real time. In other words, if on September 13th, the mayor's office gets notification that from the feds that they're getting this $1 million grant or what have you, that they immediately notify the council, that they not wait for a quarterly report. That's the essence of my motion, that it not wait for time certain, it just that upon triggering of them receiving that information, that they report to us, and then as you, the chairman, can take that item up as you choose to put it on the agenda.
And Mr. Chairman, one of the things you'd pointed out just now in trying to suggest that we could make those adjustments mid-year, we could get those in the FSRs, you're absolutely correct. We're still waiting for the year end of this FSR from Grid that has not yet been supplied. It took 20 days to just request the information for this committee today, which we've only had a couple days to review and still have a lot of questions. In fact, there's a lot of empty spaces sitting in a lot of the charts. And so I think it's critically important that we set the policy statement that we're going to maintain our current levels and have a footnote, which could always be, by the way, you can't tie the hands of future decisions. So things can always be reversed as well. But I think it's critically important to have some kind of statement that we want to support things at its current.
And in fairness, I think we've made that statement very clearly. I think that statement has been made repeatedly throughout the hearings on this issue. It was made by the rather extraordinary step, the probably unprecedented step of putting this funding in the UB pending return of a report back. So I think we've made that statement pretty clearly. And the question is now ensuring that, in fact, that statement is implemented. And I think I'm comfortable with the approach that Mr. Cardenas is suggesting of having these revenues be reported back and then dealing with it at the time that eventuality may or may not come about. If it doesn't come about, it's a moot point. If revenues do come in, then I think we've already made clear that the intention of this committee, at least, and I believe the council is, to maintain service levels at the current level. And if there's a windfall, that windfall should not be at the expense of the general fund. At the same time, I feel a little uncomfortable of telling people who are aggressively going out and trying to do exactly what we've told them to do, which is to find alternative funding sources, go out and try to develop relationships with partners in the private sector and in the nonprofit world and so on. I don't want to discourage that effort by saying, but if you succeed, we're going to take the benefits of it. So my preference would be to go with an approach there that encourages that continuing effort. And as we move forward, it's up to this council as the policymakers to decide how best to utilize that information when it comes in, of whether a grant comes in, whether new funding sources come in. We can make that assessment in the broader context of our budget as it stands in the middle of the year, in a month from now, 11 months from now. I think we're going to continue to have oversight over this program and this budget as we go throughout the year, and that's how I think we should proceed, rather than trying to anticipate all eventualities that may occur right now off the seat of our pants and laying down the law about that.
And I'll just one reminder on this is that we have the only reason we have the opportunity, and I agree with that wholeheartedly, is that it resides in an office where we don't have the information. And I think it's nothing on the fact that it's the mayor's office, but in fact, if it's any elected official's office, it's internal within their department, and right now it was moved to GCP for a reason, because they wanted the transparency and some of this information brought forward, as was shared with us in committee, and we appreciate that. And because of that transparency, that brings the dialogue of having the conditions set forth with a $6 million allocation from a general fund to cover expanded programs, which, again, we haven't looked at. We're maintaining programs that have been grant funded. So that's my argument. I understand, and I appreciate where Mr. Cardenas is coming from. I support what he's suggesting as well. I just don't support it if it's the only thing that comes out of this committee. I do support that, but I think we need to add some other fiscal restraint to it as well.
Okay. Just for the sake of time management here, are there any members of the public here who wish to provide public comment? Okay. Because I take full responsibility, and again, I apologize that we started late, but we do have to kind of bring this to a close so that we can get to council. So first, we've had a motion by Mr. Cardenas and a second, and then I want to ask Mr. Englander again to restate the points that he made because I didn't jot them down quickly enough. So first, on Mr. Cardenas's motion, the most recent motion was moved and seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, that carries unanimously. Now, Mr. Englander, if you can go through your points again, please.
Okay. Again, suggesting that the grants that come in because we fund to the grant and we budget towards those grants, that any that are unaccounted, that accounted for adopted budget be accepted with the caveat that the grant acceptance amount thereby reduce our general fund contribution to that like amount.
All right, so as to that motion, I think that the subject matter of that motion was actually dealt with Mr. Cardenas's motion.
Totally, with all due respect, disagree. I mean, it was dealt with for a process portion of it.
Yeah. Mine was process.
His was process, and
Englander's
I support the process.
Trying to set precedent that as a grant comes in, that we supplant that.
And yes, and again, what I'm saying is, if it comes in that says it's totally and completely different, then we can deal with it at that point under process, but that we at least have an instruction that that's the idea moving forward.
Then that moots the point of the process.
Well, the process.
I agree.
It could, but again, the process right now, as we have it, is we're not getting the information until well after the fact, and so if that happens,
Okay.
it's sort of.
Mr. Guglielmo.
If I could just make a suggestion, I know there was concern about the application that's provided for the grants, and there's a short turnaround that at times will happen. What has been the case with some of their departments I've worked in the past, we'll submit a memo notifying the council that we are applying for a grant, but because of the very short window to apply for the grant, it's just a notification to the council so that it can make you aware of the grants that are being applied for. It doesn't give you a chance, necessarily, the council to immediately then vote on the item because it takes time to go through that process, the committee and council. But at least that notification can come forward from the mayor's office to the council saying, we are applying for a grant. We only had 20 days, 30 days to apply, so that at least notification can be provided to help assist you in your review process when it comes to grants.
Yeah, and it still doesn't change the idea that what we're suggesting is to maintain it where it's at, and that's what my recommendation does.
Just clarification, if I could. So your motion would allow for the fact that there may be new grants that require specific actions that aren't being taken now.
Yes, and again, because that's what the process allows.
Okay.
So it doesn't change that process.
Okay, so on that point, is there a second on that part of the motion? Okay. For lack of a second, that fails. Next point.
I think the other ones are moot because they fall into the same category in terms of contributions as well, not just from grants. So with that, we'll go ahead and hopefully get the FSR final before council, so we can ask various questions there, and I can bring these items back up at council.
All right, then members, my motion then, before you go out the door, would be that we note and file the mayor's communication. Members, if I may, we note and file the mayor's communication and instruct the city clerk to place the following recommendation on the first available council agenda on or after July 1st, 2012, to transfer $5,348,825 from the unappropriated balance line item for the Gang Reduction and Youth Development Program to the line item in general city purposes budget for the GRID program. That would be my motion.
Second.
Any opposed?
Yeah.
Okay, so that motion
No.
carries by a vote of 3-1. All right, and with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I don't think it's been shared. No, but this latest one on